Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you, Luke, for that presentation. Firstly, I would like to thank Sole for inviting us to present here today, and also to thank the audience members who are here in person, and also those watching online. It's a pleasure to be back here in person and actually speaking to you, and hopefully this is a sign of things to come as we open up and are allowed to meet each other again. So the title of my talk is The Minimum Criteria for Deals, what the buyers are looking for. So I'm going to be talking in the fairly general terms here, and I'm also going to give an example of the sort of things that you need to consider when you're looking for a deal. Try and relate it a little bit to the Korean industry here for you, and then give some examples of some good things and some bad things in deals, and deals that may or may not have happened. So, first of all, picking the right time for your deal. When should you be thinking about doing your deal? And there are a lot of things to think about here. But first of all, a little bit of the theory. This is work that was done in Market Realist. It's not Pharma Ventures. And what we have here, as you can see, is on the yellow line, we have the value of a patent expressed through time as underneath a drug development occurs. And you see as it says there, discovery, and then it says trial, which is kind of preclinical. And then you get into the clinical phases and then beyond into launch. And you see the value of the patent rises over time as the drug is developed. In this case, for the patent, we can consider it to be the asset, because in a deal, what you're really licensing is the patent and the know-how. There'll be some physical elements too that go with it and some data, but it's really the patents that your partner will be licensing from you. And then the red line, you can see the level of risk. And the level of risk falls, of course, as you continue to develop your asset. So discovery stage deals, when they happen, represent very high risk, very low value. But as you progress through, the value of the deals and the value of the asset increases and the level of the risk goes down. And you see the crossover point there is around the phase 1, phase 2 development point. So it's no surprise, perhaps, when you're out in the marketplace talking to pharmaceutical companies and you have early stage assets, that they will say, actually, could you come back when you have more clinical data, or come back when you've got clinical data? What they're asking you is come back when there's less risk associated with your asset and when there's more value associated with your asset, because they'd rather you take the risk than them. The other thing we need to consider as well is, what's it going to cost them to acquire the asset from you? And how are they going to share that value with you? So there still has to be enough value left for them to make money out of it, for you to make money out of it, and for there to be sufficiently little risk in it that they feel it will get to market and they will be able to conclude the deal. So all these things come into the consideration of when the deal actually should take place. So I have to apologize now because I'm going to show you some graphs, which I'd like to claim it was a Microsoft issue, but I think it was the person operating Microsoft, which was me. And I've managed to reproduce the same graph in a number of forthcoming slides. However, it will serve to illustrate a point. So what the data here shows, and this is not oncology because you saw from Luke's slide that there are thousands of oncology deals in a single year, and not tens of. Relative to each stage of development where deals took place, preclinical versus phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, pre-registration or launched assets. And if we consider this a generic therapeutic area, and by the way, I will provide the slide with the correct data in, you can see that there's a sort of dominant number of deals occurring in preclinical phase. So this is good news for Korean companies because you tend to seek to do deals at preclinical and phase 1. Phase 1 is a little bit variable. You see the deal numbers rise in phase 2 where you hit that crossover point and the proof of concept is there and the risk has declined and the value has gone up. And then sometimes you see less deals in phase 3 and pre-registration. This is because the deals start to become very expensive to acquire, the assets. And as we said earlier, the
the level of value in it as you split it between the licensor and the licensee, and then how much money they can make, there's an imbalance there. It becomes economically less viable. In previous years, we've seen some companies, and Roche is an example, did no phase 3 deals at all. Even though you think that's the minimum risk and maximum value, the whole package has to add up. So across the different therapeutic areas, we won't see it in these slides, but I will share it later. You'll see there are some differences. In CNS, for example, phase 3 assets are very, very expensive, but it takes a lot of time and money to get them to phase 3. Earlier stage assets, much more inexpensive, more of them, but there's a lot of risk associated with them. Of course, CNS is a little bit special, if you like, because in a lot of neurodegenerative diseases, the cause of the disease isn't known. There's been lots and lots of failures, and so that plays into a reluctance to do deals until the risk level has dropped down. And of course, the expense of doing the deal has gone up. So we'll flip through these. Cardiovascular deals, there's fewer of them. CNS is the second biggest area of deal, and we just talked a little bit about CNS deals. And then there are ones like endocrine and metabolism, where the pattern is really quite different, and there are very few. There are fewer early stage deals and more later stage deals. I'll give an example here. Parameventures was approached by a venture capital company in Europe who had a portfolio of assets in companies in oncology, in autoimmune, and a few other areas. And they asked us to do exactly this exercise and tell them when do the deals occur, because they wanted to know how they should plan their investments. And we did that work, and it showed similar patterns, so a lot of deals in preclinical. But I recall one area in particular, autoimmune. The deals either happened very, very early or very, very late. And the venture capital company said, we wish we had known this when we started making our investments, because they only have a certain amount of money to invest, and they couldn't follow the deal all the way through. And they'd gone beyond preclinical, so they'd made their chances of getting a deal much less likely. One word of warning, where you see lower numbers of deals happening, it doesn't mean there aren't deals. It just means that they may be harder to do. But if you have an outstanding asset, it's always possible to get a deal done if it's very compelling. So let's talk a little bit about deal making with a Korean biotech angle to it. So one thing you can look at is how much R&D is going on in various therapeutic areas. And that kind of tells you where either pharmaceutical companies are spending their money and where they're interested in developing drugs, or where investors are placing their money. So you can see here, cancer, of course, comes out number 1, followed by CNS, and then we drift down to lower levels in cardiovascular and respiratory areas. Respiratory a little bit different, and again, a comment here, we're only looking up to 2020, 2021 not being a full year yet, and also 2020, 2021, there's a COVID impact, and it's sort of yet to play out how much that will influence, and whether there'll be some differences in the stats that we need to pay attention to. So looking at R&D pipelines is a useful indicator of where companies are active, and therefore are you in a very active area. But also, as it says there, if you're in a very active area, then there is greater competition to get a deal with a big pharma. So it means if you're in those spaces, oncology, and I know a lot of Korean companies are, your data and your story needs to be that much more compelling and complete, particularly if you're a preclinical asset or early clinical stage asset, if you're going to convince a pharma to do a deal with you at that stage. If we look at a little bit more granularity in that, and that's probably hard to see, but you see we get breakdown here of cancers, and that's breast 19 and 20. And this is the most busiest area in terms of drug candidates being developed. And then there's cancer. So it's no good just looking at cancer. You need to look at the areas also where your specific type of cancer is involved, and then drilling down into other disease areas, the sub-levels of diseases, to understand where the activity is and the sort of level of competition you might face in getting your asset developed, adopted by a big pharma. So if we're thinking about doing deals at early stages,
what are the sort of information you should be thinking about putting together and putting into your compelling stories, so that when you go and talk to pharma, they're going to ask you about things and you're going to have the answers there for them. This is a sample of the sort of things you need to consider. We have a full checklist which we share with our clients, and it is much more comprehensive than this. You don't have to have every piece of information. It's okay to have some gaps, but there are some very key pieces that you really should have, because if you haven't, it's going to be very difficult. And I'll talk about some of those as well in the examples. So at the point here, how novel is your asset? Is it a novel target or a novel mode of action? And is it first in class or best in class? Those kind of characteristics lend themselves much more to driving towards an earlier stage deal. If it's a me too, it's less likely that pharma are going to be that interested in it. They probably worked on the target already. If it's a novel target and they haven't seen it before, it could very well catch their interest. They're going to be very interested in the biology and the validation of that target, and having compelling data to say it really that target is valid and valid for that disease, and you understand the mechanisms around it. Which therapeutic areas are in vogue, which are popular, and why? And the obvious thing was where there's unmet needs. So oncology, CNS, rare diseases, because there are easier paths to commercialization and launch. Rather, it comes and goes. So there are some that come to the fore and others that fall away. We saw last year infectious disease deals, extremely popular, and it was possible to get very early stage deals because governments around the world were making it possible to approve COVID drugs very quickly and COVID vaccines. So it became very popular for a short while. Hopefully we won't need that for a great deal of time. Which one's not in vogue? Cardiovascular, not so popular at the moment. The trials are very big and expensive. And there's also areas where the needs are reasonably well met, although we can always improve. Respiratory, excluding COVID, is not so popular at the moment. Like I said earlier, that doesn't mean you shouldn't be in those areas. And if you are actually developing drugs in those areas, that's not a bad thing. There's still an unmet need there, and there's still the ability to do deals. Will you get earlier deals? Probably less likely, but it's not impossible. So something we talked about a few minutes ago there was, how well do you understand the biology behind your asset? And it's absolutely vital that you do, and you can articulate this to the other side. Earlier stage deals are driven much more by the science than the biology. There has to be a strong commercial case too, and the biology has to evidence that disease is prevalent at a level which is going to make commercial sense. So you need to be able to link all those pieces. The mechanism of action must be understood. I mean, even if it's hypothesis, but it hangs together and you can link the whole thing together, you need to articulate that and be able to defend the position and defend why you're right. You will get strong questioning from R&D scientists in those organizations. When the methodology, people go to these conferences and they tell the BD people about their assets and they say, yeah, we're interested. And one of the first things they'll do if they take the information back in is go and see their R&D scientist and say, is this any good? So your R&D does need to be strong and compelling. You need to have your lead molecule determined. If you're still choosing your lead molecule, it's highly unlikely you're going to get a very early stage deal, a deal at that point in time. And it's important that you understand where your asset fits in the whole landscape, and who are the players in that landscape. You need to sort of do your research before you go out and talk to people. It's a mistake to think, well, I want to do a deal with one of the top 20 pharma, so I'll go and talk to the top 20 pharma. Well, 6 of those may not be in the therapeutic area that you're in or the subsection of it. And if you talk to them, it really doesn't impress them if you say that, well, you haven't looked at our website and our pipeline. So arm yourself with research on them, as well as having strong stories about your asset and how that will fit. IP is absolutely vital. You've got to be able to say you own the thing that you're trying to license. and you have the ability to grant rights to it, and it doesn't reside in a parent company somewhere who will say they're going to put the rights to it into your company exclusively once you get a deal. That's not going to work. It's got to be in your control. And you should look at freedom to operate. So it's one thing to have a patent which protects your asset, but there may be other patents out there that actually could prevent you from commercializing it in certain territories. And that will have an impact on whether you're able to take this through to market and get a deal. The sort of data package that you should seek to put together for your early stage assets. Preclinical efficacy, very important in multiple animal models where possible. Should be able to demonstrate that you have got activity against the target that you say this hits, both in vitro and in vivo. And you should be able to demonstrate target engagement. So you are actually engaging with the target that you say and have data for that. The therapeutic window and how you've determined it, and that it's wide, or you can control it carefully. PK and PD data is very important. They want to see that. And within that, it's at the bottom there that you've got levels of drug at a concentration that would be clinically effective. They fall within in the expected values. Otherwise, the story doesn't start to hang up and you'll get some very awkward questions. Safety, obviously, that's very important. And within that, and all the tox that you'll need to do, if you've got a full tox package, the better, and preferably a full IND package. If you're going to try and partner pre-IND, if you've got a very compelling asset, a very compelling novel thing, you've got a better chance, but really you should get to IND as a minimum. Manufacture and CMC should be well underway, and you should understand what it's going to cost you to make your asset. Now, there are things in here that you may think, well, that's fine because the partner's going to deal with that. And they very well may be the party that's going to, particularly the phase 2 and phase 3 and commercialization. But you do have to present a story of how you think it will get to market and how you think it will fit and how you think the regulators will view it. Because the people within these companies, there was a time when there used to be teams of people that would work all that up within a pharma company and then go and present the case internally. Those people don't exist anymore, and they expect you to do it. So if you don't do it, you're putting yourself at a disadvantage, and particularly if you're an early stage asset. So you need to have thought through the whole continuum of the development cycle, the clinical development, the regulatory, the commercial. So you do need to understand the market landscape, what the competition is doing, where your drug fits, what it might be priced at, what potential deal structure, know what deal you want, and what your asset is worth so you can construct a deal. And Jessie will talk some more about some of those aspects too. And understand the regulatory path. How are you going to get approval for this? What sort of how many trials are you going to have to do? So what's it going to cost you to get there? So you need to have thought about all these and be able to articulate it to the other side. This is a different way of presenting the data, and I'm not going to dwell on it because Luke has presented some value data here. But the point being that as you move up through the different phases, the assets become worth more, as we refer back to the original slide there. Upfronts get higher, deal values get higher. However, be careful because published deal values often don't include royalties, and there's a lot of value in royalties. Good thing about royalties, every time the drug is sold, you get a payment. In milestones, you only get it once when you hit a certain value or complete a certain activity. So royalties are a really good way of capturing value. Bad thing about royalties is the same. You only get paid when the drug sells. So if it doesn't sell very much, you don't get paid very much. So think very carefully about, again, that's the kind of deal you want and you need to get when you're presenting your story to the pharma companies. So I've talked about a number of aspects of the sort of information you need to have and the sort of information a company would expect you to be able to tell them about. Obviously, you're going to disclose some of it non-confidentially. Don't fall into the trap that some companies have that I've seen in the past, where they think the more I tell pharma companies, the more they're going to like me. That's not strictly true. Don't tell them stuff that's confidential when without a CDA in place. And don't put confidential on your slides when it's not confidential because they won't look at them. Pharma have an issue with with being told things that are confidential when they're not confidential, because they could be working on the target already or a similar asset. And if you tell them something that you said is confidential and they already knew it, they're going to have a problem later if they then seem to use that information and you think they got it from you and shouldn't have. So it's to protect them as well as to protect you. But don't be afraid of disclosing under CDA. Pharma are not going to run off with your data and develop their own asset. It's not worth their while. I know there's a lot of discomfort sometimes about disclosing, but you need to be as compelling and as thorough as you can under the protections of CDAs where appropriate. So let's talk about some examples. I was in a conversation with a US biotech very recently, and with a preclinical asset. And they said they were setting themselves up because they wanted to go to market and get a deal with an upfront figure of more than $100 million. And I said, that's going to be a bit of a challenge. I don't think there are that many preclinical deals that have upfront values of 100 plus million. And he said, oh, yes, there are lots. I've got a whole list. And I thought, well, maybe I should go back and look at the data because I don't think there are. One point here, if you're starting to look at other deals to sort of compare yourself to, don't just go and find the deal with the biggest numbers in and say, I want a deal that looks like that, because it highly likely is very different from you and is not representative. But we have had people say that. However, I did find a couple of deals where the upfront was very, very high for a preclinical deal. This was a GSK deal with IDEA. IDEA received 120 million upfront. So that's a really, really large amount. However, you do have to look beyond the headline values and be careful when you're reading press releases, because it might be an outlier. It could well be atypical. This actually wasn't a single asset deal. It was a platform deal. They got access to a particularly novel area, and it was 3 potential collaborations within that. So it wasn't just one thing. Also, IDEA were covering some of the costs, and there was profit shares involved too. Platform deals, often they're badged up and there's big numbers associated with them and multiple assets. Quite often, they may only develop one asset out of the platform. But nonetheless, there are big numbers associated with them. Whoops, gone the wrong way. This was an early phase 1 deal between AZ and Daiichi Sankyo, $1 billion upfront, huge deal. But actually, it's 2 big guys who worked together before, knew what they were doing. They would have put together the packages that supported a deal of that nature. And it's a huge, extensive collaboration. So not a typical preclinical single asset deal at all. So they do exist, but it's not usual. So I'll talk about some sort of negative examples now. And these are ones we know about. Assets get rejected a lot. Pharma say no frequently. Quite often they'll say, it's not of a strategic fit for us, which is their sort of language for we're not going to tell you why we're not going to license it, but we're not going to license it. Here's an example of an asset in IBD. Phase 2 asset. This was a phase 2 design. It was 20-something patients split into 2 groups. This company had a drug which, when they treated the patients with it, the patients had become insensitive to steroid treatment for IBD. They treated with this drug, they became sensitive again. However, the numbers of patients involved in the trial was way too small. So although they saw more effect in the treated versus the non-treated, it wasn't a big enough effect and it wasn't enough patients. So they didn't have a big enough trial, data not compelling enough, not statistically significant enough, too risky. Second reason why this one fell over, they hadn't done their research on pricing. They thought they could price it like the anti-TNFs at over $1,000 a treatment. The market thought it should be priced like steroids, 20 cents a treatment. Massive difference in value, massive misalignment between the parties. The deal fell over. Top left, more things wrong than right. This was a company, actually they did approach us and said, will you try and license this asset? We looked at it. They didn't know the mechanism of action. They didn't have any very long patent life. They didn't have very good animal data. You're probably wondering why we agreed to do something. We actually said, no, we don't want to do it. But they were so sort of insistent we did try. First few companies we spoke to said, do you know the mechanism of action? No, I'm sorry, we're not interested. So you couldn't articulate the things they needed to hear. We've got some other there, lack of alignment, where the shareholders of the company didn't agree with the management and had differential views of value, hadn't done the work to prove what the value was, therefore they couldn't agree when an offer was put on the table. Too far ahead. This was a cell therapy years ago. So when we took it out, the market wasn't receptive because it didn't understand how you would manufacture it and how you would get it to patients. So the company hadn't understood this. They knew they could manufacture it, but they didn't understand how pharma would. So they didn't understand their customer. So you need to do that research. And then another one which didn't understand the market, they developed a very nice drug-device combination, which was an under-the-tongue film for treating oncology side effects. Patients they were going to treat were going to be in hospital with an oncologist, so there's no driver for them to have a self-administered drug. They'll just be injected by the oncologist. So there was no driver, no need there. And so these are all reasons where the research hadn't been done. Nice assets, nice science, but deals didn't happen. They weren't interested. So do your research. So in summary, know what stage you're most likely to be able to structure, to do a deal, to secure a deal, and understand the market, understand how the deals are done, and who's doing them, when, and at what stage. Understand that market. Yeah, who's going to be your competition? Is it very busy? How unique are you? Understand where you fit on that risk-reward curve and match that to the deals you can do and the needs of the other side as well. Make sure your data package is as comprehensive as it can be. And that's both technical and the other aspects, regulatory, commercial. Compelling story around the biology, absolutely must. Address as much as you can. Don't just talk about the science and then go, that'll get me the deal. You need to talk about the commercial as well. Don't be afraid to disclose things. Be as open as you can and disclose as much as you can, but only disclose confidential stuff under a CDA. Understand the full pathway, absolutely important, and be able to articulate it. Have a realistic expectation of what your asset is worth and what sort of deal you want to get. And keep in mind, it will take longer than you think. So a lot of people approach the deal when they absolutely must get a deal and time is running out. Go in plenty of time. Deals typically take around 12 months, but can take a little longer. And preclinical deals tend to take longer still because you're having to do the convincing around the biology and the science. And R&D scientists in pharma take a lot of convincing. Thank you very much for your time. Appreciate your attention. And I will hand on to our third speaker this afternoon, Jessie, who will talk to you about the final aspects of this seminar. Thank you.